It's a humbling reality.
Nobody should have to, bare themselves out in public.
For millions with developmental disabilities.
We've pretty much stopped going anywhere if there's nowhere to change him.
This week on Open Record.
I think that it's vitally important that we as a society meet those needs.
A campaign to transform America's restrooms.
It's unpopular to force somebody to do something like this.
Hits a roadblock in Wisconsin.
We're going to fight for it the entire time that we're here.
From the FOX6 studios, this is Open Record. I'm Brian Polson. I'm here with Open Record's executive producer, Sarah Smith. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
And we are joined by FOX6 Wake Up News anchor, once again, Carl Deffenbaugh. Hey,
Great
Carl.
to be back with you guys.
You guys even color coordinated.
I know.
Totally planned.
That's great.
Wow.
We didn't at all. It feels like it's like Easter-like, even though it's not Easter time. Anyway, we are recording this episode on Wednesday, December 18th, and our topic today is one Carl knows very well. After all, he was the first one to report on it all the way back in 2017. That's when a Brookfield mom was just beginning her campaign of advocacy for a new addition to some public restrooms, adult-sized changing tables. 7 years later, Sarah Knowles says progress in Wisconsin has been slow. We'll talk about the nationwide push for so-called universal changing tables and what's holding up broad adoption of them in the Badger State. We'll do that after this. As always, I have my cup of coffee, right? And if I'm not careful, before this podcast is over, I might have to take a quick bathroom break. We hope not. But what if there was no restroom available to me at all? That is the reality facing millions of Americans with disabilities who need help with daily care, especially older children and adults who have outgrown baby changing tables. Carl, you know this very well. You first introduced us to Sarah Knowles back in 2017. How did that come about, and what do you remember from that whole process?
It's certainly a sign, because I had to go back in my own memory bank to get back to that year, 2017. It's a sign of how long Sarah Knowles, who's featured in both of our stories, has been fighting this fight for her family and for others like her. So at the time, I believe she reached out to me, and we ended up doing a story about the push for these adult-sized changing tables. At the time, one of her two sons, Matthew, was 18. He is developmentally disabled, and he, over the years, of course, has grown from a small child into an adult at that time. He was around 90 pounds. And Sarah spoke to the need both for Matthew, but also for their family to still experience life, to not feel trapped in their own home. They were big soccer fans. They liked to go to the zoo. So we focused the story around Panther Arena at the time, UWM's Panther Arena. They were big fans of the Milwaukee Wave, but when they would go, there was no access for Matthew to be able to be changed. He was in diapers at the time, I believe still is. And at his size, he was far beyond one of those regular changing tables all parents remember from restrooms and seek out, those little baby-sized tables. So for them, it meant that every time they left the house, there was this running clock in their head. When would we have to change Matthew's diaper, and how physically would we do that at 90 pounds as a fully grown adult man at the time?
It's so relatable when you talk about that clock ticking, and I mentioned that in my story as well, because anyone who's had a young child or an infant,
true.
you go to a restaurant, and there's sort of that clock that how long can we be here before it's a meltdown and we need to go. This is similar in that way, that they go, how long can we be out before we have nowhere to change Matthew? And so it really affects whether they can experience life like the rest of us.
Well, and you mentioned those koala changing tables, which we're familiar with because we all have kids. But one of the things that you did in your story, and you mentioned it even too in the intro to the story tonight.
This.
But we call them in the business, we call them stand-ups, where the reporter comes and then in the middle of the story they're standing up and they still tell part of the story. Your stand-up was a little different. You were actually laying down. But you were making a point.
It was interesting because we had a lot of discussion with my photojournalist at the time, Andy Conkle, about not wanting this part of the story to be performative. I am not Sarah Knowles. I do not live the daily experience that she has with all of the challenges of caring for Matthew and continuing a full life with both him and her family. But we wanted to capture, and we thought it was particularly eye-opening for people to see you lying on the ground of a public restroom. You can think about that, and I'm doing that right now, and unfortunately I've had to do it with my babies over the years, right? But actually lying on the floor of a public restroom, seeing some of the grime, imagining all of the germs and all all the mess that gets made in those rooms, but that being your only option.
Right,
So what we did
because
in the
you can't
story
put the kid
was
up there, yeah.
put myself on the ground. It looks weird to see a reporter on the ground.
And you naturally just recoil at the sight,
yeah.
like, oh, what's he doing in the floor of a restroom?
Yeah.
But that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
And for her, that was maybe not every day, but a frequent experience
Right.
at that stage for Matthew, because these universal changing tables are not, in fact, universal. So depending where they would go, their only option sometimes was to, hopefully they had a mat with them, put a mat down on the ground, lay him on the floor, and change him that way.
So that was 7 years ago, and Sarah reaches back out, earlier this year. And I got to tell you, by the way, you hear Carl talk about this, and he is so articulate, and then he brings this story to me, and I think, how can I top anything Carl has done? Because he's such a good storyteller. But she came back to you not to say, let's just talk about changing tables again, but what's happened since and the problems they were running into, right?
Well, and this is the credit to you, Brian, being able to expand upon stories like that and look at the much larger issues. Ours was relatively narrowly focused on UWM Panther Arena. They were going through renovations. She was pushing the leaders at the time to include one of these adult-sized changing tables and running into some issues, while coincidentally, at the same time, Fiserv Forum was being built. Obviously, a lot more money behind that endeavor, and they were able to include one of those. And we got into some of the locations around the Milwaukee area, around Wisconsin, that have access, become a place that she can take Matthew and her family to enjoy, or the ones that are not. And what you were able to do, Brian, I believe, is look at the larger issues in terms of, okay, this isn't just one arena, one location in a city or a state. This is actually, in some senses, a national push. In some states, far more successful at this than others.
And by the way, I want to point out, after your story, the Panther Arena did install an height-adjustable adult-sized changing table.
I can't take credit for that. That's Sarah, but yes.
But her advocacy has continued on this sort of case-by-case basis, where she's going with these one-offs and getting place. She goes somewhere and says, I think this is a place that could use one. I'm going to go talk to someone. And it's a lot of work to get that done in one location. But what about the broader community? What about the broader, public and all across the state of Wisconsin? She wants to go further with that, and she has tried. So she's gotten the ear of state lawmakers. State Representative Robin Vining, 3 sessions in a row, introduced legislation that would mandate adult-sized changing tables, not in every restroom, by the way. This isn't your corner coffee shop. This isn't a small business, because it would be cost prohibitive and likely size prohibitive, because these can't fit in a small bathroom. The gas station bathroom is maybe not going to work that way.
To give people a reference point, if you're listening to this, not watching this, the adult changing tables are about 5 feet long, 70 inches or so is fairly standard, and then about 30 inches wide. But beyond that, you need about 3 feet of clearance on at least 2 sides. So
you have to have a wheelchair and a
Yeah.
caregiver who's around that table. Right.
Size-wise, these are larger investments. Price-wise, these are also larger investments.
But what she wanted to do with the legislation, and what it would have done, is required larger public spaces, places like museums, movie theaters, shopping centers, government buildings, schools, would have required places of a certain size that are required under code already to have a certain number of bathrooms or a certain number of toilets to install an adult-sized changing table in a family restroom. And that's key as well, because in Matthew's case, Sarah, being the main caregiver, is female. Matthew is an adult male. So do they go into the men's room? And Sarah's got to go in and change him? Or do they go into a women's room and an adult male is being exposed out in the open? It's just neither is really a great option. So the idea is to have these in family restrooms in these larger places. So she tries the legislative route. 3 years in a row, they don't even get a hearing. Not even so much as a public hearing to talk about this. And there aren't many people who stand up and oppose something like this openly. So the question is, what's going on behind the scenes, and why isn't this getting the attention that they would like to see it get? I did look at who has registered in favor or opposed. No one has registered against any of these bills. A couple of organizations, that is the Wisconsin Realtors Association, and there was a developers group that registered neutral, which means they want to track the legislation, but they did not write anything they did not register any hours lobbying against it. The question is, behind the scenes, what's going on? Certainly there is a concern among developers and people who build things that this adds a cost.
Right.
And is that a cost that they don't want to have to bear, don't want to be required to bear? So they haven't been able to get make any headway that route.
I think what struck me 7 years ago, and I think for you guys as well, learning more about it this year, is just thinking about this in the first place, it wasn't something that had crossed my mind. I think so many of the stories we do are perhaps with a child from Make-A-Wish or someone who is still that small child, and you don't think down the road what happens to that person as they grow, the accessibility issues for the family as that happens. And then when it hits you like that, when Sarah brings this to us, you just think, oh, yes, of course, the challenges. You spoke to some of what she did as well, degrading to have to go through that, but also the physical nature of having to deal with an adult human at that point. Matthew was 90 pounds when I did the story. I believe you
now
said he's
105,
over 105. Yeah.
Right.
And you did a wonderful job of showing just physically for Sarah, who's not a large person, what that means. These tables are adjustable height, so you're able to help and avoid your own injuries to parents or caregivers trying to handle this.
Well, just the mental health too, I think. I mean, Sarah talked about it in your story, but it's the if we don't go anywhere because we can't, because there aren't these changing tables, we're sitting, your world becomes so small, and you're just in your house because you can't leave, because there aren't these things that make it accessible for all of us. And so they're not doing the things that they enjoy doing, and that even the kids and adults enjoy doing, going to the soccer games, going to a museum or something.
And it seems like, at least at this point, and even since we did this story 7 years ago, it's still very much on a case-by-case basis. To your point, Brian, if someone's presented with this, it's really hard to say no to that, right? You look like a pretty terrible person if you say no to this loving, caring, dedicated mother or family. But from what Sarah's found, it's been mostly voluntarily adopted at these different places, and there are a number of them all across Milwaukee. When you look at Pfizer Forum, American Family Field has them, Discovery World, State Fair, the Expo Center, the Milwaukee Airport, Mitchell Airport, Lambeau
Of all
Field.
places, the Muskego and Brookfield Public Libraries have added these. And when I talked to the director of the Muskego Public Library, she said, like you said, she had never thought of it. She almost had this sense of like, I don't know if shame is quite the right word,
Right, but like,
this thought of like, I can't believe we never thought of this. We think
Yep.
we're so accessible. And the very first thing she did is she went to the library system and said, we've got to do this. And she was able to rally the support and the money to get that done.
Can I tell you guys a cool story? Proud dad moment. So we were traveling with our family over the summer, and my oldest daughter, who was 5 at the time, now 6, I don't know where this came from, but she saw someone in a wheelchair and asked, oh, how do those people go to the bathroom? And I explained, because we had done this story, that they have these devices, and we happened to be in the Seattle airport, had a family restroom with an adult-sized changing table there. So it's growing around the country, and Brian highlights Ohio specifically, but Wisconsin, it's still not necessarily widespread yet.
As you said, it is getting better. I think there are maybe about roughly 24 of these across the state. There are more going in, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on this podcast. But you mentioned the state of Ohio. Progress in Wisconsin has been slow. There are some other states that are having success. Ohio did something that will eventually change the game for everyone. We're going to talk about that right after the break. And welcome back to Open Record. So progress has been slow in Wisconsin, but in the state of Ohio, they're having great success. The question is, what's different? What are they? And that's one of the things I wanted is, what are they doing differently? Because in Wisconsin, Sarah talks about going to the legislature time and time and time again. And it's easy to look at it and go, okay, well, Democrats introduced this and Republicans opposed it, so it must just be that Republicans are standing in the way. But in Ohio, it's actually Republicans who have advanced this and who have championed it in that state, and they're having a lot of success.
It's interesting to see the different approaches, too, and you did a great job of visualizing this in your story, Brian, but Changing Spaces is the organization nationally and here in Wisconsin. Sarah Knowles runs the Wisconsin chapter of it, and they have an interactive map, which you can imagine what a resource that is for parents if you're planning any kind of trip to say, okay, where realistically can we go if this is an issue for us? It's a map of the United States. It has spots all over, including in Wisconsin, the different arenas and locations that have changing tables. And then there's just this block of dots in the Midwest right centered around Ohio.
It's very clear that Ohio, Tennessee is another place that's had some success with grant funding. But you said something interesting when you talk about the map and the idea of you can map out where you could go. It made me think of people with EV cars. If you have an electric vehicle, what do you do before you plan a trip? You go, well, where are the charging stations? Am I going to be able to get where I need to go? Am I going to be able to get back home? Similarly, if you have this situation with a child or an adult child or someone you're caregiving for, and you go, well, Can we get there? Is there a place we can stop? And one of the things that the map does is tells you where they are. It doesn't necessarily make it as easy to say, is that going to be open? I mean, that's another thing you've got to look at. Is it going to be open at 3 p.m. if I'm coming through at that time? Or is this something I have to be at a game? If it's a Fiserv Forum, do I have to have a ticket to get in? Where are the places where this is going to be accessible on my route? And so the more of those dots that come up, you have more of a comfort level that I can go there if I'm on a trip. And I know one of the caregivers said she travels for conferences all the time to talk about this very thing. And that's the first thing she does is go, okay, where are these restrooms? Where can we go and take care of this? In terms of, so what is Ohio doing differently? And that's the real question. They try the legislative route. And similar to Sarah, there's another mother there who has a son who ironically is also named, or coincidentally also named Matthew. He is an adult with developmental disabilities. She is the lead for Changing Spaces in Ohio. And she tried the legislative route, didn't go anywhere. But the state of Ohio, whatever department it is that handles building codes, they came in, they opposed the legislation, but then said, we oppose it, but we have an idea. We want to work with you on actually changing the building code. Because they said, if you get it passed through legislation, who enforces that? Right. Well, code enforcement does, but it's not in the code. So who's going to enforce it? They said it's better off to just get this in the code. So what they did is they spent 3 years working to add language to the International Building Code. They went to the International Code Council and got it added to the 2024 International Building Code, that buildings of a certain size and capacity, and I don't have the stats in front of me, but it's if they are large enough and have enough capacity and enough people using them to require 6 what's internationally known as water closets, 6 toilets, then they're required to have one of these universal changing stations in a family restroom. And that is now in the 2024 Building Code, and the state of Ohio then adopted that section of code. Because just because something is in the International Building Code, it has to be adopted state by state. It doesn't mean it's automatically in effect. So Ohio has now adopted this code, and the state of Wisconsin is way behind. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But on top of the building code, they did one more thing. Governor Mike DeWine took ARPA money.
Who is a Republican,
Who is a Republican. He took COVID relief money, $4.4 million, and made it available for people to apply for grants, for businesses to apply for grants to install these. And that set off essentially a gold rush of these installations. All across the state of Ohio, there are tables like this going in. The Ohio Department of Transportation got involved, added it to all of their rest stops. Talk about that travel convenience now. So Ohio's having this great success. They even, and we had this in our story, even built a mobile, 24-foot double-wide trailer that is a mobile changing facility, full restroom that can be taken to fairs and festivals. Where else has more fairs and festivals in the state of Wisconsin? So that kind of thing could certainly benefit people here. And I know Sarah is looking at Ohio and saying she wants to replicate that.
Can I ask a question? Maybe people listening to this or watching this might be thinking as well. ADA, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. You see handicap parking spaces, handicap bathrooms, ramps as entrances to buildings. Is that just another level that's not included in that legislation?
Well, our guest, I think, is going to be able to address that, but to the degree that I understand this, and believe me, I'm not an expert, so I'm going to try to phrase this as well as I can. We'll see if I get corrected later. But the ADA would, if something is required, the ADA would govern whether or not it meets accessibility standards. So if you have a ramp, is it the right length and distance and all these sorts of things? I don't think the ADA itself requires adult changing tables. It requires accessibility. And that's the place where I'm still a little bit gray is at what level would it require something like this? But if you have a bathroom and you install an adult changing table, now it's got to meet certain things in terms of clearance and height and adjustability and all that. So I think that is really where the difference. But you know, I say all of this like I know what I'm talking about, and the reality is I don't. I've been researching this. It's a complicated area, and I'm hoping our guest in a little bit will be able to shed some light on that. I believe she will. But you see that success happening in Ohio, and when I talked to Sarah about this, I said, so they took a different route. They didn't go the legislative route. They went through code. They got money set aside for voluntary installations. And she says she believes now after this experience that mandates may not be the way to go, at least not through legislation. She wants to try that voluntary route. She wants to try to get a grant program going in Wisconsin. Where that money would come from, I don't know. But you look, we have a $6 billion surplus? The difference between Ohio and Wisconsin that I detected in talking to Jennifer Corcoran in Ohio was Ohio has a state department of developmental disabilities where the head of that department is one of the 12 members of the governor's cabinet, essentially. She has a seat at the table. And every county has a county developmental disabilities board. And they are the ones who got involved in applying for these funds and helping businesses to apply for these funds to get this going. I think it was that person who got in the governor's ear and said, let's set aside money. The question is there anyone in Wisconsin who's getting in Governor Evers' ear and saying, hey, look at all that money. Do we want to set some of this aside? I think that's what Sarah is hoping to see happen.
How much is it to put in to install one of these?
That's a great question. You're right. We haven't even talked about that, have we? It's not cheap. But then again, it depends on the size of the facility you're talking about. Sarah says, in the grand scheme of things, it is. These tables can cost anywhere from a few $1,000s up to $10,000 each, and that includes all of the electrical work, all of the door assist buttons and things like that. The ones I've seen have been roughly $6,000-$7,000. That's a significant investment. However, if you're building Fiserv Forum, a $500 million facility, how much is $6,000 or $7,000 in the grand scheme of things? Yeah. Sarah made a point that wasn't in my story, and again, this is from her point of view, and I get that, but she looked at buildings, she looked at Fiserv in particular. She said, they're spending $2 million on art. Now, it's a beautiful place, and art has a place and it matters, but she said, if you can spend $2 million on art, can you spare a few thousand for an adult changing table to make your facility accessible to people who otherwise couldn't go? And I think that from her point of view, it's a drop in the bucket.
Maybe another question people might have as well is, how many people would this actually be for? What are some of the numbers when it comes to Americans with disabilities and the ages of those Americans when it comes to people who would actually be using these tables?
That's a great question, and I did ask Sarah that. I asked Jennifer Corcoran that, and they don't have a specific answer. It's not easy to track what that number would be. They have some different numbers that you can sort of extract from, which is there, I believe, are roughly, and now I don't have the numbers in front of me, but by memory, it was roughly maybe in the neighborhood of 20 million Americans with developmental disabilities. How many of those need this kind of everyday care where they would need assistance in a restroom like that? I don't know the answer to that. But they said in addition to adults or children with developmental disabilities, you also have an aging population, elderly population, where there are going to be a lot more people who are caregiving for parents who may end up needing something like this. There are many situations where this kind of thing could come into play. So it's hard to put a number on how many people this would serve. And that may hinder them in trying to sell these on a legislative level. If you can come in and say it's this many millions of Americans, or to sell it to a business and say this is how many customers you might be leaving out because they can't come to your place. I think that's one of the things they tried to do in Ohio when a Buc-ee's was going in. Buc-ee's, so the state of Ohio adopted this new code. They thought it would cover giant places like a Buc-ee's. I mean, these
for people who are not familiar, Buc-ee's.
It's they're the biggest gas stations in the world that have giant stores, and it's an experience. It's like an all-day experience. People go. They have the greatest restrooms in the world. It's one of the things they're known for, right? They have these big, expansive restrooms with dozens of stalls, and they're very clean, and that's one of the things one of their signatures. So they thought, since their restroom is your signature, let's put one of these in and keep you at the top of the list.
Seems like a layup.
They thought so. Buc-ee's said no. And they thought, well, you'd be covered under Ohio's new code. As it turns out, there's already a loophole in that brand new code. And it was the way they counted the capacity of Buc-ee's. Even though it was a 76,000 square foot facility that's going in this place in Ohio, the capacity was calculated at something like 729. And I think the Ohio's code is for facilities with a capacity of 3,000 or more. So by the way it was counted, they weren't required to have one. They said they weren't going to put one in. And in it was a local community board meeting where they were talking about this, Jennifer Corcoran spoke up and she said, Wisconsin is watching this, because there's a Buc-ee's that might be going in the Madison area. They're going to be watching this closely. So if the Buc-ee's is built in the Madison area in Dane County, will it have one of these tables? Well, I guess we'll wait and see.
I keep going back to a quote from Sarah Knowles in that first piece we did, again, 7 years ago. As we've discussed here, there is a cost that comes with it. There's an accommodation when it comes to renovating your building or adding this to the plans if it is a new build as well. And as we just discussed, okay, maybe this is a smaller percentage of the American population or the folks that would be using your museum, your stadium, anything like that. But for those people, it can be life-changing. And Sarah had this one quote from the story: it becomes a very small world that you live in. If you don't have access to places like this, you become trapped at your house. You can't go out. You can't experience life. And that's both for the child or the parent or the caregiver in this case. And it does seem just such an easy answer if you can figure out the money and the other things.
I saw someone who was testifying at the hearing in Ohio about the Buc-ee's facility, and she said something that I thought really stood out, because I've wondered, why are we just now hearing about this? You talked about once you hear about it, it's an aha moment. Why are we, it's not as though there haven't been people who had this need for a long, long time. So why are we just hearing about it? One of it's the technology, obviously, the tables, things like that. But another is, and she pointed out that years ago, many of these same people who are now getting out of the house and existing in the world and participating in life were institutionalized, or they were just homebound. They weren't living life. And now there's an opportunity not only for them, but for their caregivers, their family members, to experience our communities, experience the arenas and the museums and the movie theaters and the shopping centers. But this is the linchpin. This is the last piece. You've got all of these other things that are out there to accommodate people, but this piece is missing. If this piece is missing, it can be enough to keep you home. And Sarah said, when it gets to be wintertime, we don't go to the zoo as much. We do stay home a lot. Yeah. So, maybe they're going to a Wave game. Maybe they go to a Bucks game. Beyond that, there aren't a lot of places they can go and enjoy life. I want to talk more. We talked about these going in sort of one by one. There's another new place that's going to be adding an adult changing table very soon. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. When we come back, we have the Community Access and Legislative Policy Analyst for Independence First, who's going to be joining us. Rebecca Rabatin will be with us right after this break. And welcome back to Open Record. We are joined now by Rebecca Rabatin, who is with Independence First, which will soon be adding its own universal changing table in Walker's Point. Is that right?
Correct.
So you guys are in the process of doing this now. You've been sitting here listening to us talk about this. First of all, I want to know what stood out to you that we got wrong or that you'd like to add to, because I'm talking about this. We always talk about becoming a fast expert on things we know nothing about. This is your world, so tell us about it.
First of all, thank you for having me. And as far as anything that I have to add, I think you did a lot is accurate, what you have there. But this isn't only for individuals with developmental disabilities, but someone like Tammy Duckworth, who is a mother, who is a wheelchair user, who has a child that she needs to use that changing table as well to change that change that child on using that table. And also, there are some of my coworkers that have injuries, spinal cord injuries, that their caregivers at one point in time would have need to use something like this at that time, before they were able to be in a wheelchair and change themselves. That wasn't there. And so it's not just strictly developmental disabilities, but really for all disabilities.
That's a great point. Maybe we were being too narrow in our calculations there on who would get access to this as well. Could you tell our listeners, our viewers, about Independence First, and then also about how you learned about this whole concept of universal changing tables?
Oh, sure. So Independence First is a center of independent living. There are 8 within the state of Wisconsin, and we were established as part of a mandate under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 to support individuals with disability to live independently within the community, and that there are 5 core services that we are to provide. And one of them, and this is what I do, is advocacy, on an individual and a systemic level. And as far as me first hearing about universal changing tables, I previously worked with the city of Milwaukee. I was their ADA coordinator the last 7 years of my time working for the city. And I had attended a ADA symposium in Pittsburgh, I think in 2018.
Wow.
Sorry.
You look fantastic.
I'm so sorry. 2018. And I met Sarah at that time with changing tables at that event. And that's when I first learned about changing tables.
So what I want to know is, you mentioned your background. You worked with the City of Milwaukee, Department of Neighborhood Services. You've worked with Department of Public Works. You have an engineering and construction background. And we're talking about something that obviously installing an adult changing table isn't as simple as mounting a board on the wall and nailing it to the wall and we're all said and done. So can you talk about maybe some of the complexities of getting adult changing tables into some of these places?
Sure. I think you touched on a lot of that already. Is one, having the space to be able to do it. You're looking at, once the table comes down, that's 30 inches usually, and then you need what they call maneuvering space beyond that, 36 inches by 48 inches, adjacent to that for a side approach. You're also going to need room for a reach range to be able to control those buttons to lower that table. For example, someone like Tammy Duckworth, that would need that she still can reach that. And then you're still going to need your what they call clear spaces also at your lavatory or sink and your water closet or toilet. So you need all of those maneuvering and clearing spaces as well.
So Carl asked a question that I fumbled around to answer, recognizing that I just don't know what I'm talking about. Americans with Disabilities Act, you're very familiar with this. How does that apply to this issue, or does it apply really at all?
So the Americans with Disability Act itself, or the regulations, say that for a public entity, which is state and local government, that you are to be accessible in all your programs, services, and activities. So therefore, even if the ADA standards that talks about the built environment, the kind of comparable to the building codes, how you build something, if it's not addressed there, you still have that obligation under regulations to be accessible. And if you're providing restrooms, are they accessible for everyone? Some may say, oh, well, you have a accessible stall, but how does that work for someone that you have an adult child that you need to change and you need that universal changing table or adult changing table? It's not addressed in the ADA standards as well, but that ADA regulation still says that you should be accessible in all your programs, services, and activities.
I'd be curious with the background in local government as well. You heard us discussing the different possible paths and what has tried and ultimately at this point failed in Wisconsin versus the approach that Ohio ended up taking. Do you, with your expertise, see what you think is a stronger or clearer path forward to these becoming more available and access to them easier?
Oh,
Loaded question.
Yeah, so you already mentioned that the state of Wisconsin is still using the 2015 building code. I know that they were looking at Department of Safety and Professional Services, which is the department that looks at building codes and evaluates them, and what they call Wisconsinisms or tweaks to those building codes. They were looking at adopting the 2018 building code, but due to public comment and what they were hearing back, they did not adopt those. I don't know where they are as far as looking at, so there's been 2018, 2021, and now we have 2024, but we're still in 2015. So that seems to be a slow process. I thought legislatively that might have been a faster process, but it doesn't seem like that's working. Maybe an executive order by the governor could be a possibility. I don't know.
I heard you talking about that, and I think about, on the one hand, it's in the International Building Code now, so you think eventually Wisconsin will get there, but that could be, from what you're describing, potentially years or decades down the road.
Could be.
Do you think that it will eventually get there, though? I mean, and I asked Sarah this question, will this ultimately be something that we look back on one day, or future generations look back on one day and say, well, yeah, that's no brainer. Of course we have adult changing tables.
Just
of course
like
we have
handicap accessible stall that's already in so many bathrooms around the country.
Do you think we're headed there eventually?
I hope so, yes. I think there are other individuals, say that someone does not necessarily need a universal changing table or adult changing table, but still may need assistance. And just having that all-gender toilet room would greatly help. So someone needs additional help in that restroom, in that toilet room. I think that push and bringing the importance of that need will also help with this need for universal changing tables.
Now, if there is any place that is appropriate for an adult changing table, it seems like Independence First would be it. And you're in the process of doing that right now. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, actually, either today or tomorrow, we're going to be starting construction on that. It's being built with grants that we received from WISPAC and another organization.
The Reeve Foundation, did I get that right? Okay, I'm looking at.
Thank
By the
you.
way, we're going to tell you who just told me that in a little bit. It's a great surprise. So the funding, because that is a key piece of this, right? Being able to pay for it.
Yes, but I also want to point out that there is also available tax credits and a tax deduction as well.
If there's another organization or maybe a place watching, listening to this, realistically, what does that transformation look like? What is the process? How difficult is it to do exactly what you guys are doing, which is take an existing space and add one of these adult changing tables?
One is to look at your existing space. Do you have enough room? If you're looking at, we already have a single-use restroom in our facility, but maybe the layout is something that we needed to address, and then we needed to add on more space. So we kind of bumped out into another space to be able to accommodate the universal changing table. So that, first of all, looking at your spatial relationship that you have available, I think is the number one.
Now, one of the things that I had mentioned earlier was some of these places, they have one of these facilities, but they might only be open to people who are ticketed patrons. So it's not like you could be driving through Milwaukee and stop off at Fiserv Forum. I don't know, maybe you can, but I'm not sure if that's available. But the one that you will have when it is finished, my understanding is it will be available during the daytime, sort of as if somebody was driving through town, they could conceivably stop and use this. Is that right, or do you know?
Sure. They can come in during our operational hours and come and use our restroom. We have reception, and they can just roll up and say, I need to use your universal bathroom. And we will let them come in. And we also have plenty of accessible parking in our facility.
And when are you hoping that this will be completed? What's the projection?
I'm not sure on that. I'm going to look to our guest.
But
next
construction
guest.
Beginning as we're talking, as we're recording
Yes,
this
correct.
podcast on December 18th. Well, I don't know, Carl. Do you have any other final?
I guess
thoughts?
I would ask maybe one final question. I think we can't stress enough how big a champion Sarah Knowles has been for this effort. She has been a leading voice in Wisconsin and connecting with people really across the country with this. You said you met her years ago at this point. She continues this fight. I'd be curious how much of this we owe to her, how much of this we owe to other mothers and families, and what you have been inspired by over the years working with these people.
Definitely owe a big credit to Sarah. And I think accessibility, period, is a constant fight. It's a constant fight. Because these comments, we don't have the money to do this, to make this accessible, it's a constant fight. So unfortunately, you have people like Sarah that we need to continue to champion for these things.
You know, we talked about it's not an easy thing to do. There are a lot of people who need this, who it's an uncomfortable thing to get out and step out and be an advocate when you're already maybe overwhelmed with your own caregiving responsibilities, to step out and talk about these things. And not everybody wants to talk about the need to go to the bathroom. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but an important one.
Correct. I can speak from my own experience. I was a caregiver for my mother, who towards the end of her life was in a wheelchair, and just, do we go out? Do we go out and have a lunch? Because could it be able to even use the bathroom? And a lot of times it was no.
Well, that is changing one place at a time, thanks to the work of Sarah Knowles and others. Rebecca Rabatin, I got that correct again? Rebecca Rabatin?
Rabatin.
Second time I got it right. With Independence First. Thank you so much for being here on Open Record. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
And we are going to go off the record when we come right back. And it is time for us to go off the record. This is the part of the podcast where we get a little more casual and have a little fun by answering a question for which we have done no preparation. Carl hasn't, I haven't, and neither has Myra Sanchik, former FOX6, longtime Fox 6 reporter who is here. She's here because she is, I already forgot your title.
I knew it. I told you I was going to
She's
tell you
Director of Marketing.
Director of Marketing and Strategic Partnership with Independence First. Myra, thank you for coming back. It's so great to have you here.
This is such an important issue. I'm just really happy to be here watching this. And watching from this side of the camera is great.
Just wait until you get Sarah's question, so you get to be a part of this too.
Okay.
What do you have?
All right. Well, this is kind of a nice little tie-in because this is a little bit of a reunion with Myra being back in the building. My question is, with all the social media and things that are out there, do class reunions still make sense? You know, everything about a lot of people. Oh,
no, because online seeing people's stories versus seeing them again in person. I've had, I hate to say how many reunions we've had now, but we had our...
What year, Brian?
So I graduated in 1990.
Stone
so
tablets.
we're about to have our 35th next year, but I went to our 30th, and I was surprised how many people actually still came. We had maybe 50 or 60 people. I had a graduating class of like 400, so huge class, but 50 or 60 people, and I've seen them, followed them online. But then you see them in person, to hear them, to have that conversation is a whole different level of connection. And I think it kept a lot of us more connected online after that. Okay. Because now it's like, okay, now I want to see more of the story. We talked about your kid who's going to college or this sort of thing, and now I want to see what else is happening. So I think they still are relevant.
I think, unfortunately, my answer is no, but I wish it was yes, if that makes any sense. So perfect example, I just had my 15-year college reunion a month ago or so. I'd been looking forward to it, kind of had it on the calendar for the last year or so. It's close-ish to Milwaukee, so could make a weekend trip of it. And then as it got closer, I realized that most of my friends who were all kind of spread around the country now were not coming back. So all the people I'd want to see were not going to be there. And I already
have
keep
a
in
Zoom
touch
reunion.
with them. Yeah, so
right.
I mean, that's what we do, right? We have a text chain. We talk to them all the time. So the reason for the reunion, for me at least, was not there. And I ended up not going after all of this. So I love the idea. I would love to go back and catch up with a bunch of people from high school and college and things like that, but I think the feasibility of it, unfortunately, has not panned out.
But you see, I follow Myra on social media, but she's here in person, and it's so great to talk to Myra in person. I don't know, how about you, Myra? What do you think about it?
Well, you're talking to somebody who just did not go to their recent high school reunion from Nicolay High School. I'm really sorry. It looked like a great time from social media. But I think it's really important, even if you connect through social media, to also see people in person.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great. I mean, we can't just sit there and scroll,
It's very different the time that you have.
It's very different.
Yeah.
You can't hug somebody and really catch up with them and look in their eyes. And especially some of the guys, you don't know who they are because they've gone bald, so you have to look in their eyes. And you look in their eyes.
See, I think the harder part is, at least with the guys, they have the same last name they had in high school.
That's fair.
With the women, sometimes the name has
you'll
changed,
have
and if you
name tags.
don't, right?
Okay.
Well, if it's done well, sometimes you don't,
Okay.
or you've got to do. This is the thing at a reunion. You walk up to someone, and then there's the eye glance down, and the eye glance down. Am I catching this? Who was this? Oh, right. And sometimes you don't get it even after the eye glance, and that's an awkward moment.
My 20-year high school was supposed to be the year COVID happened. And so we, had just pushed it. And now there's like a Facebook group that's looking at the 25th. And I'll just read the comments. I'm here for it. But like some of the ideas, I'm like,
But think of how many people would go, I want to meet Open
the
Record
star of
Sarah
Open
Smith.
Record.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
They won't. Yeah, I don't know. Whatever. Take them or leave them. But
Myra, have you been to any
problem.
previous Nicolay reunions?
I did, and that's why I know about the experience of having to look down at the name tag, hello, my name is, or look in the eyes. The eyes stay the same, and it's really interesting, and it's kind of bittersweet when you go to that because you realize the time marches on.
yeah.
But then also at the same time, have I kept in contact with any of these people?
Well,
No.
and the people that you want to keep in contact
Yes.
with, I feel like, are the ones that you do keep. You have the
Which
text
is
chains.
easier because of
I
social
get
media.
together
Yeah.
with a lot. I have a very good core group of high school friends that I still am very close with, and so those are the people where we joke that we should all just go and sit in the corner and still talk with each other.
Now, here's the
lunch
for those,
all over.
For those who've been to a reunion, here's my question: is when you go and if there's 50 or 60 people, do people still gravitate to the old cliques from the places from back in time? Or that's one of the things that or is it an opportunity to break that down and go, hey, we're all older, we're grown up, without all the stuff.
I don't think they do it out of like malice. I think it just naturally happens because you remember
like a middle school dance. You're just kind of going to where you're
you just
safe.
remember that you hung with those people.
Now let's zoom in on Sarah while we talk about the middle school dance memories.
I didn't go to very many middle school dances. My first dance was "I Will Always Love You" by Whitney Houston.
That was your first slow dance?
Yeah, first slow dance.
One day we'll talk about my first slow roller skate. the couples skate.
I gotta
and
write
what
this down.
I did.
Okay.
And what I did was save that for another time.
All right.
But what I did.
Myra, don't you miss us? Aren't you glad you came back?
Totally miss you.
Have
She's
you
coming
ever-
back every Wednesday at
Yes.
9:30.
If you've ever had a moment where you just have shame wash over you when you think about it, that's my experience.
First
we'll talk about that
slow
another day.
roller skate.
Oh,
Got
we're
it.
out of time.
Yeah, we're
Convenient.
look at that. We
Look at
really
that.
are out of time. Okay, we're going to take a break and wrap things up when we come right back. And that's all the time we have this week for Open Record. If you have a topic you would like us to discuss on Open Record or an issue you think we should investigate for Fox 6 News, please send us an email to fox6investigators@fox.com. As always, thank you to the people who make this podcast possible. Sarah Smith, Carl Deffenbaugh, Myra Sanchik today back there, and of course, our guest, Rebecca Rabiton from Independence First. We also want to thank, of course, our editor, Dave Machuda, and our chief photographer, Cale Zimney, manning the video switcher today. With that, I'm Brian Polson. We'll be back next week.
No,
oh, no,
we
wait a
won't.
minute. Oh, I knew I was
No,
going to do that.
I was waiting. And I was waiting. I was going to give you the benefit of the doubt.
Last week I tried this. We will not be back for the next couple
Or
of
the
weeks.
week after.
We will be playing a couple of our best episodes from 2020.
Actually, one of a Carl Deffenbaugh, another Carl
those will be-
Deffenbaugh
I
episode.
will be back next week. I don't know about you guys.
Other than that, we'll be back in the new year. We'll see you then.